Hello everyone, and welcome to today's story. This is not just history, it's a journey into the darkest corners of the human mind. Today, we explore the life of Ed Gein, a quiet man from a small town in Wisconsin whose actions would change the way the world sees horror. In the 1950s, his crimes shocked America and revealed a reality more terrifying than any fiction. His story later inspired legendary movies like Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and now returns to the screen with the Netflix series Monster, the Ed Gein story. This is a story about fear, loneliness, and obsession, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening monsters are real. It all began in 1906, in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Ed Gein was born into a quiet and isolated world, a place surrounded by empty fields and long winters. His family lived far from the rest of the community, and that distance would soon shape his entire life. His father, George Gein, was a poor farmer and a heavy drinker. He struggled to keep work and often spent the little money he had on alcohol. At home, he was silent and frustrated, sometimes angry, but mostly defeated. His mother, Augusta, was the complete opposite, strong, strict, and deeply religious. She believed that the world outside their small home was full of sin and evil. To her, almost everyone was corrupt and dangerous. From an early age, Ed and his older brother Henry were taught that women, except their mother, were instruments of sin. Augusta read the Bible to them every night, often choosing verses about punishment, death, and moral purity. She spoke about heaven and hell as if they were just around the corner, watching their every move. Her words became the law of the house. What she said was never questioned. For Ed, Augusta was more than a mother. She was a teacher, a guide, and the only person he was allowed to trust. He admired her completely, following every rule she gave. She kept him away from other children, convinced that contact with them would lead him to sin. When local boys invited Ed to play, she refused to let him go. "The world is full of wicked people," she would say. "You must stay pure." Because of this, Ed grew up alone. His days were filled with chores on the farm, reading the Bible, and listening to his mother's endless warnings about morality. He watched other children from a distance, curious but afraid. At school, Ed was quiet and shy. He didn't talk much and was often the target of other children's jokes. Classmates later remembered him as polite but strange, a boy who sometimes laughed at odd moments, as if he lived in a world of his own. His grades were average, but he loved reading unusual books, especially stories about anatomy and the mysteries of death. Despite the cold atmosphere at home, Ed loved his mother deeply. He wanted nothing more than to make her proud. When she praised him, even with a small smile, it felt like sunlight after a long storm. But her approval came rarely, and her anger was terrifying. She often reminded him that disappointment meant disobedience to God. This strict and isolated life shaped Ed's mind in ways no one could see yet. The farm became both his home and his prison, a place where his imagination had no limits, but his freedom did. While other boys dreamed of adventure, Ed dreamed only of pleasing his mother. And as the years passed, that devotion grew stronger, turning into an obsession that would define the rest of his life. As Ed grew into adulthood, tragedy began to follow him. His father, George, was the first to die. Years of drinking and illness finally ended his life. Ed and his brother Henry tried to keep the farm running, but their relationship became tense. Henry often criticized their mother's control over Ed, calling her influence dangerous. Then, in 1944, tragedy struck again. The brothers were burning brush near the farm when the fire got out of control. After the flames were put out, Henry was found dead. The official report said he had suffocated, but some details never made sense. He was discovered lying in an area untouched by fire, with signs of injury on his head. Many people in Plainfield wondered if his death had truly been an accident. Just a year later, in 1945, Ed's world completely collapsed. His mother, Augusta, suffered a stroke and passed away. For most people, losing a parent is painful. For Ed, it was devastating. She had been his teacher, his protector, and his only connection to the world. Without her, the quiet farm became an empty cage. Neighbors said he was never the same again. Ed sealed off the rooms where his mother had lived, leaving them untouched, like a shrine frozen in time. He slept in a small, dirty corner of the house and stopped caring for himself. In his loneliness, his mind began to twist. He spent hours reading about anatomy, religion, and strange medical experiments. Some books even described grave robbing, and slowly, curiosity turned into obsession. Ed began visiting cemeteries at night, drawn by a dark idea. If he could not live with his mother, perhaps he could bring her back. 4 years, Plainfield, Wisconsin, remained a quiet, isolated farming town where everyone knew each other. But beneath that calm surface, something dark was waiting to be discovered. On a cold November morning in 1957, a local hardware store owner named Bernice Worden disappeared without a trace. Her son, who was also the town's deputy sheriff, noticed that the last name written in the shop sales book was Ed Gein. Suspicious, he and other officers drove to Jane's small farmhouse on the outskirts of town. What they found inside would shock the world. When police entered Ed's house, they stepped into darkness. The rooms were filthy, filled with dust, newspapers, and garbage. But as their eyes adjusted, they began to notice details that made their blood run cold. Hanging from the ceiling, they found the body of Bernice Worden. That discovery was only the beginning. As investigators searched the rest of the house, they uncovered objects that seemed beyond human understanding. There were household items made from human remains, chairs and lampshades crafted from skin, bowls made from skulls, and clothing stitched together from preserved flesh. Faces had been turned into masks. In a small box, police found pieces of bone and organs, kept as trophies or strange keepsakes. Among the strange items discovered, one stood out for its disturbing symbolism: a belt made from human skin, decorated with nipples. It became one of the most disturbing symbols of Ed Gein's madness, showing how his obsession with the female body had crossed every imaginable limit. The officers could barely believe what they were seeing. It looked like something from a nightmare or a horror film that hadn't yet been written. Reporters would later describe the scene as a museum of death. When Ed was questioned, he remained calm, almost polite. He confessed that he had visited local cemeteries at night, digging up the bodies of recently buried women who reminded him of his mother. He admitted to 2 murders: Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, a local tavern owner who had gone missing years earlier. Psychiatrists later said that Ed suffered from severe mental illness. His devotion with his mother had twisted into something far darker, a desire to bring her back, to become her in a symbolic way. Many of the disturbing objects in his house were part of that obsession, a reflection of a broken mind that could no longer tell the difference between love, grief, and horror. Psychologists, criminologists, and even filmmakers continued to study Ed Gein for years, trying to explore the darkness within the human mind. Doctors described him as quiet, polite, and cooperative, but completely detached from reality. He showed no real understanding of the fear or pain he had caused. Gein suffered from schizophrenia and delusions of resurrection. His obsession was not only with death, but also with identity, a desperate need to become his mother and bring her back through the bodies of other women. Psychologists concluded that his crimes were not acts of pure evil, but the tragic result of guilt, repression, and deep psychological trauma. News of the discovery spread across the United States within hours. Newspapers called Ed Gein the Mad Butcher of Plainfield. Yet beyond the shock, there was also a strange fascination. People wanted to understand how someone so quiet, so ordinary, could hide something so unimaginable from everyone around him. Perhaps Ed Gein represented a terrifying truth, that evil does not always wear a monster's face, but often hides within loneliness and obsession. Ed was quickly arrested and taken into custody. He was sent to a psychiatric institution, where he spent the rest of his life. He died there in 1984, at the age of 77, a man whose body lived on, but whose mind had long been lost to madness. The small town of Plainfield would never be the same again. What had once been just another farming community was now a name forever linked with horror. A few months later, Ed's farmhouse burned to the ground. No one ever discovered who started the fire, but many believed it was the town's way of erasing a place that had become a symbol of horror. Ed Gein's story didn't end with his arrest. In fact, it was only the beginning of something even darker, a legend that would echo through generations. What happened in that quiet Wisconsin farmhouse became one of the most disturbing inspirations in modern culture. Newspapers covered every detail, turning Ed from a forgotten farmer into a figure of national horror. But soon, filmmakers and writers began to look deeper. They saw in his story not only violence, but something more complex, a reflection of human fear, loneliness, and obsession. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho, introducing the world to Norman Bates, a quiet man devoted to his mother, hiding terrifying secrets in a lonely motel. Bates' twisted relationship with his mother was directly inspired by Ed Gein. The film became a masterpiece of suspense and changed cinema forever. Years later, in 1974, another movie took the horror even further. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre presented Leatherface, a killer who wore masks made of human skin and lived in isolation, echoes of Ed's disturbing reality. It was raw, chaotic, and unforgettable, turning real horror into art. Then came The Silence of the Lambs in 1991, where the character Buffalo Bill continued the legacy, a man obsessed with transformation, identity, and the human body. Each of these stories took something from Ed Gein's mind and reimagined it in new, terrifying ways. But perhaps the most haunting part is how his story refuses to disappear. Decades after his death, Ed Gein still fascinates the world. Documentaries, books, and even podcasts continue to explore his life, trying to answer the same impossible question: how could an ordinary man create such extraordinary horror? Now, Netflix revisits his story in Monster, the Ed Gein story, showing a new generation the man behind the myth. The series looks at his crimes not just as events, but as symbols of fear, isolation, and the darkness that can grow inside the human mind. Ed Gein's name has become more than just history, it's a mirror reflecting our own fascination with fear. Perhaps that's why his story endures, because it forces us to face the uncomfortable truth that sometimes real horror doesn't come from monsters, but from people who once seemed ordinary. Ed Gein's story is not really about monsters, it's about what happens when isolation, trauma, and obsession destroy the human mind. His life reminds us how dangerous loneliness can become when it grows without compassion or understanding. It's a dark story, but also a warning, one that teaches us the importance of empathy, mental health, and staying connected to others. When we lose those things, even the quietest soul can fall into darkness. In the end, Ed Gein's life reminds us that understanding the mind is as important as judging the crime. Knowledge and empathy are what turn horror into awareness, and awareness into prevention. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found it interesting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that help you learn through history and language. And remember, even the darkest stories can teach us about humanity if we choose to learn from them.